Quote, "Whatever of depth, mystery, mask, spirit, cunning and greatness has been bestowed upon it, has it not been bestowed through suffering, through the discipline of great suffering? In man, creature and creator are united. In man there is matter, fragment, excess, clay, mud, madness, chaos. But in man there is also creator, sculptor, the hardness of the hammer, the divine spectator and the seventh day. Do you understand this antithesis? And that your pity is for the creature in man, for that which has to be formed, broken, forged, torn, burned, annealed, refined, for that which has to suffer and should suffer." Unquote. That's from Beyond Good and Evil 225.
What does not kill me makes me stronger.
This is the Will to Joy podcast. Will to Joy is a resource for personal growth and transcendence based on the extraordinary teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Will to Joy podcast. Jimmy here, your host. I'm hoping that you've had a good couple of weeks since our last show. This week we're going to be talking about that most cheerful of topics, suffering. Suffering and its value according to Nietzsche. Is suffering ever good? Is it something that we always should be avoiding? Should suffering be welcomed sometimes, honoured, perhaps even made sacred? And this is jumping off from our explorations of self-overcoming in the last couple of shows. So before we get into that, a little bit of news from my end. Firstly, I did mention previously that I'll be attending the International Friedrich Nietzsche Conference in Belfast in September. I've now been asked to present a paper at that conference, which is kind of exciting and a bit nerve-wracking too, because that will be an academic conclave at Queen's University, and I'm not an academic. I do have a master's, but generally I don't really get on with academia because I find it very difficult to follow somebody else's syllabus. However, I do understand the conventions of academic referencing and what have you, so I'm pretty sure I can put together an exciting paper. And certainly they were interested in my proposal, my abstract that I submitted. So yeah, exciting stuff. The paper is called An Economy of Bodies, and it's about sex, beauty, social status and the will to power. So if you're attending that conference, you'll get to hear that paper. But if you're not attending that conference, I'm sure I will be doing a show on it. Probably not the next show, but the one after that I think is a distinct possibility. The next show is likely to be one of my wandering audio diaries, which I did one of a couple of months back, attempting to walk the South Downs Way on the south coast of England. That ended in failure. I bit off more than I could chew. I'm fairly confident I should crack this one though. This one's in the north of England and it's a 100-mile circuit around the Lake District in Cumbria, which is extremely hilly, so it's going to be challenging in terms of the calves, and there will be a lot of sweating, I'm sure. And also I'm wild camping, so I'll be taking a huge great backpack again with my water and tent and all the essentials. I'm going to do it over a week, but I'm going to break it halfway because after 3 nights of wild camping, I think I'm going to be in need of a shower and probably will need to recharge my devices as well. So at some point I'm going to have to charge up my phone, which I'll be using for navigation. And of course, recharge this device too, because I'm going to be recording myself as I make that journey. So you've got that to look forward to in the next show. But today's topic is, as I say, suffering. And let's start with an anecdote. Many years ago, I knew somebody, a woman actually, who shall remain nameless for the sake of confidentiality, but this woman suffered a bereavement and lost a child, and it happened suddenly and tragically, and of course, inevitably, they were plunged into terrible grief. Such was their despair that they went to the doctors for some help, and the doctor, trying to be helpful, I guess, applied a medical solution to what was actually a human problem and prescribed antidepressants. So this woman took the antidepressants and found that emotionally it put her back on an even keel. And after 12 months, she decided that she didn't need the antidepressants anymore, didn't really want to develop a long-term dependency, and of course stopped taking them. And you won't be surprised to hear that immediately and suddenly she was plunged right back into the midst of that grief that had been sitting around waiting unprocessed. And what interests me is that this is a story about suffering and about the inevitability of suffering and the inescapable nature of it. Sometimes suffering can't be evaded. You kind of have to face up to it. You have to go through it. The way out is through, as they say. And of course, life is full of suffering of all kinds. Physical, mental, emotional, existential. We all age. We have illness, injury. We face exhaustion and ultimately death. We have regrets. We feel shame or guilt. We fret about the future. We worry. And we struggle and strive. And we're subject to fear, disappointment, rejection, humiliation, heartbreak, and of course, grief. It's a part of life. And though understandably we try to limit it, we can't escape it entirely. So suffering is both inevitable and inescapable. It's actually part of our human nature. The fact that we desire things, that we want the future to be better than the past, means that we experience a state of lack a lot of the time. And a state of lack, a state of desire, is its own kind of suffering. As Nietzsche puts it, slightly abridged here, man is, quote, the unsatisfied, unsatiated one, the eternally future one, who no longer finds any rest from his own pressing energy, so that his future digs inexorably like a spur into the flesh of every present, unquote. That's from Genealogy of Morals 3:13. So yeah, the fact that we're always striving for something in the future means that we're always experiencing a sense of deficiency, and that's a kind of suffering. Desire, need, craving for something better. And consider that even someone whose every need and every whim is met, so that theoretically at least there's nothing further they could want, well, they're not guaranteed happiness either. People get bored very quickly. Think of your own experience. You might enjoy a 2-week vacation sitting by a pool and sipping cocktails, but by the end of that fortnight, it's already starting to wear thin, isn't it? I mean, imagine if you were doing that same thing month after month after month. It would probably in the end turn into a kind of hell. So good or bad, humans can get used to just about anything. And speaking of getting used to anything, and as a small aside, there's some guys drilling outside at the moment, which is damned inconvenient. So if you're hearing that, I can only offer you my apologies. I'll do what I can in the editing, but it's something that we're just going to have to suffer for the time being. Now, as a civilization, we expend enormous efforts to eliminate suffering, and really that's what our science aims at principally, especially in medicine and health, of course, but also in our political systems and our social policy. They're all about ameliorating unnecessary suffering. But what if it's not just that some suffering is inescapable, just something that we have to suck up, but what if there's actually something valuable in the suffering itself? This is what Nietzsche contends, and he actually diagnoses our obsession with suffering's elimination as something pathological, which seems completely counterintuitive to us. Can suffering be valuable? Can it be sanctified? Our modern, secular hypersensitivity attempts to expunge suffering and discomfort. To quote Nietzsche again, quote, owing to the universal inexperience of both kinds of pain, he's talking about physical and mental pain there, and the comparative rarity of the spectacle of a sufferer, an important consequence results. People now hate pain far more than earlier man did, and calumniate it worse than ever. Indeed, people nowadays can hardly endure the thought of pain, and make out of it an affair of conscience and a reproach to collective existence." Unquote. And that's from the Joyous Science 48. So, this idea that life is inherently painful is something that philosophers and religious thinkers have picked up on. I mean, we've discussed in the past already Arthur Schopenhauer, the great German pessimist philosopher, and the way that he decried life because it's, for him, a cycle of desire, satiation, and boredom, which just goes round and round and round. And so he condemned existence as evil and advocated resignation. Similarly, the Buddha, who we've also mentioned, condemned the world when he said, "All life is suffering." And of course, the Buddhist approach, the Buddhist solution to that is renunciation. So both of those thinkers preached detachment from desire, as did the Stoics, in fact. They all sought to alleviate the suffering of life through detachment too. Now, Nietzsche disagreed that suffering was a problem per se, and saw in those who resigned or renounced or detached themselves from craving as desiring a stasis in a world that is characterized by becoming. A Schopenhauer might say, "I'm hungry, but what's the point in eating? I'll just be hungry again in a few hours." There's a kind of unrealistic desire, so there's irony for a start, to achieve a stasis, an unchanging state of desireless satisfaction. But to be static and unchanging is to be dead. The world just doesn't work like that, and it's the only world we have. And so to condemn it is, for Nietzsche, the most basic form of nihilism. For Nietzsche, it's not suffering that's the problem. It's meaningless suffering. Quote, "Man, the bravest animal and the most prone to suffer, does not deny suffering as such. He wills it. He even seeks it out, provided he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose of suffering. The meaninglessness of suffering, not the suffering, was the curse which has so far blanketed mankind." Unquote. From Genealogy of Morals 3:28. Now, the meaninglessness of suffering has been brought into sharper focus for contemporary humanity by the death of God, at least for those of us who are secular and atheist. The religious, they have their theodicies. A theodicy is an explanation for why suffering exists in a world created by a perfect and benevolent being. And theodicies provide real meaning. The fact that there's a God and that there's a master plan means that your suffering is for some reason. It's a test, or it's a penance, or it's a punishment. And it's temporary, at least if you play your cards right. You can end up in heaven where everything is bliss for eternity. Your trust and faith in God, in the big man, meant that this was all part of the plan, and so your suffering was redeemed in the end. And yet, in a godless world, we're fated to fall like blossom. Everything changes. Seas rise and fall, as do mountains, as do civilizations. Milk sours, flowers wilt, swords rust, and bones crumble to dust. Every human triumph, no matter how spectacular, is utterly effaced from memory in the end. A remarkable infant unexpectedly matures into extraordinary beauty or phenomenal ability, like a new star lighting up the night sky, so ephemeral because it's doomed to be ravaged by time. A wonder that will ultimately trace an unswerving downward trajectory towards ugliness and decrepitude, becoming in the end, like all of us, nothing more than a feast for worms. And even the stars themselves, unimaginably vast, diminish, smoulder, and are completely extinguished in the fullness of time. The seasons turn inexorably, and everything falls apart. So for Nietzsche, the ancient Greeks had a wonderful solution for this tragic character of human existence in their Dionysian tragedies. And this is a healthy approach to the reality of suffering, because it doesn't rely on the assurance of eternal life in some afterlife. Instead, it strove for a sense of oneness and connection and absorption in the whole of existence, not in the world, but of the world, always at home, and so living and then returning to the great womb of being from whence you sprang provided some kind of existential comfort. So Nietzsche commends an approach similar to the Greeks, and it's not a theodicy, suffering explained and justified by God moving in mysterious ways, but is instead a cosmodicy, suffering explained and justified as part of an inalienable condition of a glorious whole. Will to Joy is a new and tender green shoot striving towards the light. If it's going to thrive, it needs the sunshine and gentle rain of your support. If you find value here, support me by doing a few simple things. Hit follow so you don't miss the next episode. Follow Will to Joy on all the main social media platforms. Drop the podcast a review. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you know people who get something from this material, please do share it with them. And please consider supporting me in this project for a few dollars a month. There's a link in the show's description. And if you feel ready for it, you can now also become a De Profundis member on Patreon with exclusive episodes that delve deeper into Nietzsche's philosophy for life. Link also in the show's description. Your support will ensure that I can keep producing the Will to Joy podcast to support you in your own flourishing. Thank you. So let's consider the value of suffering. Certainly, it seems to be part of growth and aspiration to something better. That doesn't mean it's a good in itself, of course, but it's instrumentally good. By it and through it, we attain our goals. Pain, discomfort, adversity, these are not the enemies of a flourishing life, but its conditions. You might recall that in episodes 7 to 11, we dug into Nietzsche's idea of the will to power as it manifests not just in political or social dominance, but as a psychological existential principle. The will to power is not about sitting atop a mountain. It's about the ascent. It is the drive to overcome resistance, to master oneself and the world in ever more refined and subtle ways. And this drive, because it always seeks something to overcome, entails struggle. It means friction. It means pain. In this light, suffering is not a glitch in the system. It is the system. It's the engine that turns the wheel. Joy requires suffering. Imagine you get a cable car to the top of a mountain. No stress, no struggle, no effort. You might enjoy the view from the top, perhaps take a few snaps. Now compare that to the feeling of having climbed to its summit, the peril, the strain, the doubts about whether you can make it. It's easy to see how that last case entails the joy of achievement, of triumph, whilst the former case, getting ferried to the top in a cable car, just doesn't. If you climb the mountain, you challenged yourself and you rose to that challenge. Like Nietzsche says, weak pains mean weak pleasures. Nietzsche asks us to radically rethink suffering, not as something to be minimised or eliminated, but as something to be accepted, endured, and where possible, transfigured. The modern ethos of comfort, security, and avoidance is antithetical to this. The will to power needs adversity. It feeds on it. Because to overcome is to face down ordeals that will test you. The greater the trial, the greater the likelihood of failure, but the greater the triumph if you succeed. And there's an evolutionary logic to this. Natural selection, indifferent and brutal as it is, bestowed us with dissatisfaction as a spur to survival and reproduction. Creatures that were contented, unperturbed, easily pleased, they didn't make it. We did, because we suffer and because we do something about it. Quote, For the Creator himself to be the child newborn, he must also be willing to be the mother and endure the mother's pain. Unquote. And that's Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In his myth of the three metamorphoses, the camel bears the burden, the lion slays the dragon, and only then can the child, symbol of creative innocence, be born. But it is not born painlessly. Creation is agony. You must bear the burden. You must face the dragon and vanquish it. To bring forth something new, you must first destroy something old. Often, yourself. This is self-overcoming. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of the hero's journey, that transcendence to a new octave involves a crisis. That truth, and it is a truth in my opinion, is summed up beautifully in this little adage. In the cave you fear to enter lies the treasure you seek. How profoundly true is that modest proverb? Quote, all becoming and growth, everything that guarantees the future involves pain. Unquote. That's from Twilight of the Idols. It's not just that pain accompanies growth, it is growth, in a sense, in its rawest form. And the great danger of a society obsessed with wellness, with safety, with comfort at all costs, is that it forgets this. It forgets the alchemy of suffering. It wants to eliminate the very conditions of strength, of growth, of transformation. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche calls this out with ferocious clarity. Quote, the discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you not know that this, and only this, discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? That tension of the soul in unhappiness, which cultivates its strength, its shudders face to face with great ruin, its inventiveness and courage in enduring, persevering, interpreting and exploiting suffering. Was it not granted through suffering, through the great discipline of suffering? Unquote. So notice the verbs there: enduring, persevering, interpreting, exploiting. These are not passive acts. They are creative responses to pain. The stronger soul is not the one who avoids suffering, but the one who makes something of it. Suffering becomes the forge. A sword is tempered by fire. And Nietzsche doesn't shy away from the harsh implication. In Beyond Good and Evil 225, he writes, quote, you want, if possible, and there is no matter if possible, to abolish suffering? And it really does seem that we would rather increase it and make it worse than it has ever been. Unquote. Now that's strong stuff. But remember, this is about suffering that can be made meaningful. There are some sufferings that defy this. Terrible afflictions that it's difficult to view as anything but senseless. And yet, even here, Nietzsche thinks that the higher type might be able to find something to leverage, to value. And I should say that here we're talking about the individual's approach to their own suffering. We're not advocating for the suffering of others. We're not suggesting that famines in developing countries are a good thing. Not at all. It is in your attitude to your own struggles that there might be opportunities for transformation. Suffering raises the stakes. It heightens the drama. It increases the value of the prize. The higher the mountain, the more dramatic the view, and the more bitter the winter, the sweeter the spring. This too is why Nietzsche mocks the shallow hedonism of scientific humanism in the Joyous Science section 12. Quote, the ultimate purpose of science is to give people as much pleasure and as little pain as possible. But suppose that pleasure and pain are so intertwined that whoever wants as much as possible of the one must also have as much as possible of the other. Unquote. And he goes on to push the point. Quote, even today you have a choice. Either as little pain as possible, in short, analgesia, or as much pain as possible as the price of a luxuriance of subtle and seldom tasted joys and pleasures. Should you decide in favour of the former, you must also moderate and diminish the human capacity for joy." Unquote. This is the cost of anaesthesia, a dull life. Numb the pain and you numb the joy. So much of our suffering is about contrast. So much of our joy is hard won. If you want rejoicing to heaven, be prepared for grieving unto death. As he puts it elsewhere in The Joyous Science, quote, "Oh, how little you know about human happiness, you comfortable and good-natured people. For happiness and unhappiness are sisters and twins, which grow tall together, or in your case, remain small together." Unquote. That's the choice. Grow tall or stay small. And we mustn't forget, suffering is part of who we are. It's constitutive. To affirm life is to affirm suffering, not as just or fair, but as real, as necessary, as ours. The greater the trial, the greater the triumph. This isn't just greetings card sentimentality, it's the logic of overcoming. Nietzsche again in Twilight of the Idols, section 19, writes, quote, "Test the life of the best and most productive men and nations. Whether a tree which is to grow proudly heavenward can dispense with bad weather and tempests, whether disfavour and opposition from without do not belong to the favouring circumstances without which a great growth, even in virtue, is hardly possible." Unquote. He sees it as a selective pressure. And this reminds me of something I read about rose bushes, that if they are not battered by wind, they don't put their roots down very deeply. Then, if an unexpected ad hoc storm comes along, there's a good chance they will be uprooted and swept away. The bush needs to be buffeted around, at least to some extent whilst it's growing, to develop its strength. And that reminds me of Nietzsche's notions that a person is only ever as strong as they need to be, i.e., easy living makes you soft. The rugged pioneer can bear more adversity than the wealthy, urbane, cosseted man of leisure. And of course this all makes perfect sense. Often that which crushes the weak strengthens the strong. Suffering can be a crucible. The higher type endures the vicissitudes of a hard life and becomes stronger thereby. But as Nietzsche argues, it's not enough just to take the rough with the smooth. One has to love it. Nietzsche deplores those who denigrate the world because life is hard. It's the only world we have, and as such, it is to be revered. Knowing that the world can be tough and cruel, whilst remaining faithful to the earth, Nietzsche calls a pessimism of strength. We get a glimpse of this pessimism of strength, this celebration of difficulty, in The Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche writes, quote, "Is there a pessimism of strength, an intellectual predilection for what is hard, terrible, evil, problematic in existence, arising from well-being, overflowing health, the abundance of existence?" Unquote. It's not masochism. It's resilience with a dash of cheerfulness. The desire to be tested and to love the world, even with all its apparent evils, that's to have passed the test. And yet, not all suffering is chosen. Not all pain is noble. What then do we make of grief, of loss, of trauma, the death of a child, the senseless ruin of something beautiful, the slow decay of the body? These cannot be justified, but just maybe they can be transfigured. In the face of meaningless pain, we construct meaning ourselves. This is the power of the human to impute meaning. Think of bereaved parents who, having lost a child to some terrible disease, set up foundations, social movements, scholarships, charities in honour of their lost child. This is to give meaning where there is no inherent meaning. Meaning can be forged, even post hoc. Your child's life, a loss that seems so meaningless, gains meaning once more through saving the lives of other children. But not all meaning is good meaning. There are instances of false and unhealthy meaning. The ascetic ideal we find in Christianity is the signature case for Nietzsche. Here we find the unhealthy worship of suffering rooted in resentment, self-hatred, and contempt for the body. Christianity, at its worst, sanctifies pain as punishment, as purification by self-negation. Nietzschean asceticism is entirely different. It's not hatred of the self, but the cultivation of the self. It is a reverential, life-affirming asceticism, not to mortify, but to strengthen, not to deny life, but to command it. As he writes in Will to Power 9:15, quote, "It is my desire to naturalize asceticism. I would substitute the old intention of asceticism, self-denial, by my own intention, self-strengthening, a gymnastic of the will." Unquote. So we honour suffering not because we deserve it as some kind of punishment. No, we honour it as an inevitable part of life and a schooling for the spirit. When Nietzsche says, "What does not kill me makes me stronger," this is not a claim of fact. It is more like an affirmation, a statement of intent. And this is not just theory for Nietzsche. His own life was a prolonged experiment in suffering. Already in 1880 he wrote, quote, "My existence is a fearful burden, and I would have thrown it off long ago if I had not been making the most instructive tests and experiments on mental and moral questions in precisely this condition of suffering and almost complete renunciation." Unquote. He used his pain. He mined it. Every philosophical insight he had came through affliction. Remember Nietzsche's words from one of his private letters. "I must learn the alchemist's trick of turning even filth into gold." And in The Joyous Science, he makes a staggering claim. Quote, "In the end, the great question might still remain open, whether we could do without sickness for the development of our virtue, whether our thirst for knowledge and self-knowledge would not especially need the sickly soul as well as the sound one." Unquote. Could it be that suffering sharpens us, that health itself is a prejudice, that illness, pain, spiritual crisis, these are not errors, but teachers? He answers with brutal clarity, quote, "It is great pain only, the long, slow pain, that compels us philosophers to descend into our deepest depths. I doubt whether such pain improves us, but I know that it makes us more profound." Unquote. Profound, not in spite of pain, but because of it. Quote, "One emerges from such long, dangerous exercises in self-mastery as another person, more ticklish, more mischievous, with a more blithesome disposition, with a second and more dangerous innocence, more childish and 100 times more sophisticated than before." Unquote. This is the Nietzschean rebirth, not a moral improvement, but a transformation, a deepening, a shedding of illusions, an intensification of life. And Nietzsche credits his illness with everything. In Ecce Homo he declares, quote, "I have often asked myself whether I am not more heavily indebted to the hardest years of my life than to any others. As for my long sickness, do I not owe it indescribably more than I owe my health? I owe it a higher health. I also owe my philosophy to it." Unquote. And perhaps most shockingly, quote, "Never have I felt happier with myself than in the sickest and most painful periods of my life." Unquote. That's not the voice of comfort. That's the voice of conquest. In the absence of gods, we do not have to explain suffering. We have to face it and make something of it. We do not have to find meaning in pain, but we can create meaning from it. The tragic nature of human life, its mortality, its frailty, its vulnerability, demands a heroic attitude, a refusal to go quietly and be cowed by the tribulations of life, a dignity in resistance. And only humans, so far as we know, can be heroic, because only we can choose our own pain. So take the hard road when the easier one is available to us. That is what heroism is. That is what courage is. If you're interested in exploring your own orientation to suffering and experimenting with more detached perspectives on it, check out the practice of Via Dolorosa, which is an extra for De Profundis members on Patreon. Via Dolorosa means the way of sorrow, which should give you some clue as to what's involved. Now, all this is not to fetishize pain and suffering. It's to have a positive and practical attitude to an inalienable part of life. Suffering is a means, not an end in itself. That said, as something necessary and useful, it's possible to make our own suffering sacred. Or is it? We honour suffering as a teacher and as a transfiguring force, but can we do this without any trace of regret or resentment? Can we affirm it wholly? Can we even feel gratitude for it? This seems like a tall order, but consider that we already view some kinds of suffering as sacred. Recall the bereaved woman from the start of the show. The doctor tried to help her outrun her grief, but in the end, that just wasn't possible. So think about this. If you were able to flick a switch that prevented you from feeling any sense of pain or distress at all, even if your child had been killed, would you want that? Could you choose it? Sure, the pain of such bereavement would be terrible, but would you really want to go about your business unperturbed as if nothing had happened in such a scenario? I'm sure most of us would find this idea perverse. The pain of grief in the wake of such a tragedy feels like the appropriate response, the human response. This is suffering of the worst kind, and yet only by accepting it and undergoing that pain do we honour the love we had for our child. I think here perhaps we see how sometimes suffering is sacred, is sanctified. Suffering that is far from pleasant, but is, in the truest sense, right.